It's Christmas dinner, and I'm analyzing the asymmetry of my little brother's front teeth. The 8 other people gathered around the long table in my parents' dining room are chatting happily, but I can't stop staring at the shape, color, and lack of robustness of my brother's front teeth. Should a 24-year-old's teeth be that yellow? Is the upper left front tooth noticeably eroded, or is that a chip that's been there since he was a kid? Surely I would have noticed a chip previously. I zoom out from the teeth and begin to pick apart the pallor of Rob's skin, the dishwater yellow of his eyes, the sharpness of his collarbone. He looks like he's on a bi-monthly hygiene schedule, and his hair isn't part of the program. I notice a small crimson scab on the bottom corner of his chin, and I recall what I found the previous night. The night before, I had laid there in the spare twin bed, unable to sleep, examining the detritus of my brother's childhood. Everything seemed an artifact of a divide we had always had trouble bridging. Rob is 6.5 years younger, somehow both a peer and a generation removed. Growing up, I often understood our parents' perspective better than his. As I endured the turmoil of adolescence, he was entering kindergarten, and by the time he hit high school, I was stepping into real-world adulthood. I looked around his room and saw the objects that connected us but never seemed to bring about deeper understanding. The skateboard that we'd both attempted and failed to master, the vintage punk CDs we both listened to, though not together. When I finally decided to turn in for the night, I turned off the Seinfeld reruns and began looking for an outlet to charge my phone. I nudged the bed away from the wall and found the outlet I was looking for, along with a dozen or so scorched strips of foil that had been carelessly discarded on the floor. When I saw these metallic scraps, I froze, realizing I'd found the final sign in a long list of signs that something wasn't right, each of which, up until that point, I had ignored. The first sign was Rob's overall shabbiness and the occasional appearance of scabs on his face. Rob was always the kid with unlikely bodily misfortunes, like the time a minuscule piece of pool cover somehow became lodged in his eye for 6 weeks and required some sort of temporary eye patch. Both a fragile and resilient kid, those images are woven into the fabric of who he is in my mind. His scrawny frame and large head with a white eye patch taped to his left eye, trying to shoot hoops in our front driveway without the benefit of depth perception. I tried to convince myself that the scabs were just an extension of that borderline comical tendency toward injury. Probably just a skateboarding accident. Yeah, that makes sense. I reassured myself there was nothing more sinister than some low-level clumsiness. So I did nothing. There was also the time a few months prior when I overheard Rob as he was watching a TV special about opioid addiction. As the screen showed a young man about to check himself into recovery, desperately downing large handfuls of olive-sized pills which he knew would be his last before the unpleasant withdrawals kicked in, I heard Rob's mocking laughter. "Are you watching this?" he said into his cell phone to an unknown party on the other end. "Ha ha, what a pussy." For days afterward, the mocking laughter rang in my ears. Rob had a history of big talk. Whereas my nature has always been self-deprecating, Rob liked to puff out his chest and make obnoxious remarks. He hit his growth spurt fairly late, and I'd suspected this tendency was a byproduct of being on the small side for much of his childhood. With this in mind, I decided to convince myself it was an innocuous joke. Young male bravado as overcompensation. And I did nothing. There was also the time a couple years ago when we were all supposed to go on a long weekend vacation to Massachusetts. My mom undoubtedly hoped the trip would be the entire family in cable knit sweaters, marveling at the New England fall color. An image out of a J. Crew catalog, but with less attractive models. I went along, but Rob declined, citing the need to stay behind to focus on recording some music that he was trying to sell or something like that. This fit the pattern we'd established. I was the older child who aimed to please my parents and fulfill their expectations, and he was the one who blazed his own willful path. At the end of the trip, I returned home a day or two prior to my parents and dropped by their house. I found that Rob, who was living there at the time, had obviously had a party, and the half-tidied kitchen was still scattered with copious cheap beer bottles. On the half-cleared counter, there was a ballpoint pen housing, with the inkwell and tip removed. This common item revealed itself as conspicuous. It had some sort of cloudy gray residue around the opening. In spite of my own utter cluelessness about drug paraphernalia, I recalled the scene from the movie Traffic. Didn't the DEA agents party or kids use something similar to suction the smoke from freebased cocaine or heroin or something like that? I paused at the counter and thought carefully about what laid before me. Was I reading far too much into something that was completely out of my depth? Or were Rob and his friends actually getting blitzed on hard drugs while the rest of the fam wholesomely toured the Revolutionary Trail? Was I just reading too much into a broken pen on a countertop? I decided it was likely just used to scrape some residue out of the bowl of a weed pipe, or something else I knew equally little about. Harmless cannabis use, not hardcore narcotic use. I did nothing. And then there was Thanksgiving, just a month before, when Rob and our cousin were hell-bent on consuming as much white wine and Mexican beer as humanly possible. It was the first Thanksgiving since our maternal grandparents had passed away, and I was struggling to adjust to the new normal. Thanksgiving was so closely associated with Graham and Gramps. Graham cooked a brutally simple roasted turkey and stuffing served with gelatinous cranberry sauce. Gramps would fall asleep after the big meal watching Wheel of Fortune. The holidays in our family were simple and quiet affairs. We didn't break into the Bud Light at the opening of college kickoff. There wasn't an uncle who would dip too deep into the peppermint schnapps and start ranting about his ex-wife. I've never seen anyone on the maternal side of my family anywhere near a state that resembled intoxication. There seemed to me something sacred about our understated, sober Thanksgivings. Rob's brazen booze swilling seemed somehow to insult this tradition. In between bites of pie, as Rob's tipsy volume level swelled, I shoved back from the folding table and stormed dramatically out to the porch, trailing insults behind me about him being some kind of an asshole. When he apologetically confronted me on the porch a few minutes later, he asked why I was so upset. Why had I lashed out when he was simply trying to enjoy this Thanksgiving with our family? Why was something benign so offensive to me, the way it seemingly had been for our entire childhood? Why was it that for as long as he could remember, I had seemed unwilling to have fun? Why was I such an Eeyore, unable to laugh and joke and horse around with him like most big brothers did? His apologetic questions suddenly morphed, and he launched into a confessional litany of his own unhappiness. How the void between us had affected him. How I should be happy because my life is good. How his was comparatively messy. How he'd been mixed up in darker things than I could dream of. I can no longer recall everything that followed. It's all a blur of emotion in my mind's eye. There was a cascade of repentance and confession, a less than veiled reference to hard drugs. There were tears. He may have explicitly mentioned crack or heroin or both. I don't remember. I don't remember because I was actively trying not to listen. I wasn't ready to confront this notion that my kid brother may be in serious trouble, that this was his invocation for help, that he was reaching out for a shoulder to limp along with as he hobbled out of his current state of fear or despair or both. But I wasn't ready to listen to such a plea. I was too wrapped up in my own petty distractions to inconvenience myself in these sordid matters, fixated on the sound of my own problems, of paramount importance, my inability to find the right mid-century teak desk in my price range, my girlfriend's tepid sex drive, the fees I was paying for my 401k's managed funds, a whole lot of comfortable middle-class bullshit that squeezed out all the room in my psyche for digging into anyone else's problems with any sort of engagement or empathy. Why alter my private reality to enter into uncomfortable shared space with others? That crowded subway of real life where people sit with dirty elbows touching, rubbing the grime of their suffering against my starched white shirt. Why limit my blindness to the suffering of tsunami victims, child sex workers, and factory farm feedlots when I could include my own flesh and blood in that neglect as well? For all my alleged maturity, I didn't know how to have a simple heart-to-heart with my little brother. To tell him I was concerned. To let him in. to swallow my own fear about what he was wrapped up in and offer him help. I'd failed to be his keeper and protect him the way an older brother should. I wasn't ready to muster the courage to address the untidy truths that sat right there in the dark on the porch with me. So I did nothing. It's Christmas dinner, and I'm analyzing my brother's teeth. He sits across a table filled with plates of pie and a pile of evidence I can no longer ignore or explain away, or pretend is beyond the range of my hearing. And I'm forced to confront the reasons why, for all this time, I've done nothing.
That's VAMP first-timer Matt Wilson.